The Great Northern War. Origins of a clash, Sweden's ascendancy and brewing rivalries. In the year 1700, the balance of power in Northern Europe teetered on the brink of a seismic shift. Sweden was at its zenith, a Baltic empire commanding territories from present-day Finland to Estonia and beyond, and ruled by a young, militarily brilliant king, Charles the Brainton. Surrounding monarchs viewed Sweden's dominance with alarm and envy. In Russia, the energetic Tsar Peter I, Peter the Great, hungered for a window to the west, access to the Baltic Sea that Sweden's realm presently denied him. Likewise, the kings of Denmark-Norway and of Saxony-Poland harbored grudges over lost lands and influence. Sensing opportunity in the youth of the Swedish king, barely 18 in 1700, these rivals secretly forged an alliance, sharpening their swords for a coordinated strike. Charles X, though young, was steeled in resolve. Upon learning of the looming storm, he famously declared, "I have resolved never to start an unjust war, but never to end a legitimate one except by defeating my enemies." This bold statement was no empty boast. Charles was determined to defend his empire's honor and territory to the last. As winter ebbed in early 1700, the stage was set for a massive conflict. The Great Northern War was about to erupt, a 21-year saga of ambition and survival that would dramatically remake the map of Europe. It would pitch Sweden's Karelian warriors, as Charles's soldiers were known, against a grand coalition of powers, and ultimately witness the rise of Russia as an empire and the eclipse of Sweden's century of greatness. 1700, war erupts and the young lion roars. The war's opening moves were as swift as they were daring. In February 1700, King Frederick IV of Denmark-Norway struck first, invading the Duchy of Holstein-Gottorp, a Swedish-aligned state in northern Germany. Almost simultaneously, Augustus II, the Strong, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland-Lithuania, marched his forces into Swedish Livonia, laying siege to Riga. From the east, Tsar Peter's Russia advanced toward Swedish Ingria and the fortress town of Narva on the Baltic coast. Three powerful armies threatened the Swedish Empire from three directions, hoping to crush the young King Charles before he could react. Charles V moved with astonishing speed. First, he turned upon Denmark. In summer 1700, leading a joint Swedish-Dutch-English expedition, Charles executed a sudden amphibious landing on Zealand, the heartland island of Denmark. In a dramatic strike, Swedish forces even bombarded the Danish capital Copenhagen to force Frederick IV to capitulate. The Danish king, caught off guard, sued for peace. By August 1700, the Peace of Travendal was signed, knocking Denmark-Norway out of the war's first round without a pitched battle. One prong of the Grand Alliance had been blunted by Charles's boldness in a matter of months. No sooner had Charles humbled Denmark than he immediately ferried his army across the Baltic to face the Russian threat in Livonia. By November 1700, the Swedish king, still only 18 years old, arrived with about 10,000 men at the besieged town of Narva, where Tsar Peter's vastly larger army encircled the Swedish garrison. The situation looked dire. Roughly 8,000 Swedish troops against nearly 40,000 Russians dug in behind entrenchments. Winter's onset had brought freezing gales and snow, and the inexperienced Russian soldiers, many of them newly conscripted by Peter's frantic reforms, had superior numbers and position. Surrender or retreat seemed the only realistic options for Charles at Narva, but the young king had other ideas. Map of the 1700 Battle of Narva, contemporary engraving. Charles IV attacked from the west, left, with around 10,000 Swedes against a Russian army 4 times larger. The Swedish assault during a blinding snowstorm achieved total surprise. On November 30th, 1700, November 19th OS, as a blizzard raged over Narva, Charles X decided to attack the Russian lines in the midst of the storm. The howling wind and snow were blowing directly into the faces of the Russian troops. Seizing this providential moment, Charles rallied his Karelians. Despite the pleas of some officers to wait out the gale, he is said to have shouted that the weather itself would be their ally. Under cover of driving snow, the Swedes advanced. At 2 p.m., they struck in 2 compact columns, so close to the enemy that visibility was almost zero until the last moments. Muskets flared through the swirling snow as the Swedes unleashed a withering volley at point-blank range. Russian soldiers, caught utterly off guard, fell like grass under the blast. Within minutes, Swedish grenadiers and pikemen were overrunning the Russian trenches. One eyewitness described the onslaught. "They returned a heavy fire and killed many fine fellows," a Swedish officer recounted, But within 15 minutes we filled the ditches with fascines, stormed the ramparts with cold steel, and a terrible massacre began. The Russian lines dissolved into chaos. Panicked and blinded by the blizzard, many Russian recruits turned and fled. In the desperate crush of men trying to escape over the Narva River Bridge, the bridge collapsed, drowning hundreds. Some pockets of Tsar Peter's elite guards, the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky regiments, made a valiant last stand, forming squares and barricading themselves with wagons. Charles X personally led repeated assaults on these stubborn troops, at one point having his horse shot out from under him in the fray. By evening, the Russian army was disintegrated. 10 generals and countless officers were captured, and entire regiments ceased to exist. Of approximately 40,000 Russian soldiers, over 8,000 lay dead on the field, and many more drowned or captured, whereas Swedish losses were around 2,000 tons, a lopsided victory almost too dramatic to believe. The Battle of Narva was a stunning triumph for Charles X and a humiliation for Russia. Tsar Peter the Great, who ironically had departed the camp shortly before the battle, responded to the catastrophe with resolve. Upon hearing how his army had been routed by Charles, Peter did not despair. "They have beaten us once," Peter reportedly told his advisors, "and they may beat us again. But they will teach us in time to beat them." In this defiant statement, the Russian Tsar turned Narva's bitter lesson into motivation. He immediately began overhauling his forces, recruiting and drilling new troops through the winter, even melting down church bells to cast new cannons for Russia's arsenal. Narva, for all its brilliance, would not end the Russian threat. Indeed, Peter treated the defeat as a blessing in disguise, vowing that next time his army would not be so green. For now, however, the first year of war ended in an unequivocal Swedish victory. In the span of a single year, 1700, young Charles XIX had knocked Denmark out of the war and annihilated a Russian host 4 times the size of his own force. Diplomats across Europe were astonished. A British writer, Daniel Defoe, marveled that 1700 was the most glorious year of victory that ever a king of 18 had. But the Great Northern War had only begun. Charles X, emboldened by success, now set his sights on his remaining foe, King Augustus II of Saxony, Poland. Sweden's Blitz of Triumph. From the Baltic to the heart of Poland, 1701 to 1706. Flushed with the victory at Narva, Charles X chose an unexpected strategy. Instead of pursuing the retreating Russians into the depths of their country, a decision that in hindsight might have ended the war early, Charles pivoted southward. His aim was to knock Augustus II out of the war and secure Poland-Lithuania as a compliant ally, thereby eliminating Russia's partners on the Western Front. In essence, Charles sought to secure his rear before engaging the Tsar in earnest. Thus began a lighting campaign through Poland and Saxony that would add to Charles's legend. In July 1701, Charles's forces crossed into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Despite facing larger combined Saxon-Polish armies, the Swedes won battle after battle. They swept aside Augustus's troops at the Duna River, Riga, in 1701, and won a significant victory at the Battle of Klisov in July 1702, where Charles, outnumbered yet again, defeated the Saxon-Polish forces and even captured the enemy camp. By 1703, the Polish capital of Warsaw had fallen to Charles's army. The young Swedish king's march seemed unstoppable. Contemporaries likened him to Alexander the Great, cutting a bold path across Eastern Europe. Determined to remove Augustus II from the Polish throne, Charles engineered a political revolution in the Commonwealth. In 1704, with Charles's army at his back, a faction of Polish nobles convened a special election, the Warsaw Confederation, and deposed Augustus, selecting Stanisław Leszczyński, a Polish noble friendly to Sweden, as the new king of Poland. Stanisław the Wern was essentially Charles's puppet, but his installment showed the extent of Swedish influence after just a few years of war. Augustus II refused to accept this turn of events and continued fighting from his hereditary Saxon lands, but his position was weakening. One of the most famous battles of this Polish phase occurred in February 1706 at Fraustadt, in Saxony. There, a Swedish force under General Carl Gustaf Rehnskiöld, one of Charles's ablest commanders, faced a combined Saxon-Russian army. Rehnskiöld executed a brilliant double envelopment maneuver, a tactic reminiscent of Hannibal's ancient victory at Cannae, encircling and destroying the enemy army. The Battle of Fraustadt was a carnage. The Saxon army was virtually annihilated, with thousands of Russian mercenaries also killed or captured. So complete was the victory that historians compare it to a northern Cannae. This triumph left Augustus II with no field army to speak of. By September 1706, the once formidable Augustus II was forced to come to terms. In the Treaty of Altenstedt, October 1706, Augustus formally abdicated the Polish crown, accepted Stanisław Leszczyński as king, and withdrew Saxony from the war. He even handed over to Charles the unfortunate Johann Patkul, a Livonian noble who had originally masterminded the anti-Swedish coalition, whom Charles promptly had executed for treason. With Augustus temporarily neutralized, Charles XIV stood at the height of his power. By early 1707, Sweden and its allies controlled Poland-Lithuania, and all of Charles's initial enemies, Denmark and Saxony-Poland, had been beaten into submission or compliance. Only Tsar Peter's Russia remained in the fight, the one foe Charles had left for last. During these years, 1701 to 1706, while Charles rampaged through Poland and Saxony, Peter the Great had not been idle. Taking advantage of Charles's absence from the Russian front, Peter methodically rebuilt and modernized his military. He reformed his army along European lines, drilled his soldiers relentlessly, and welcomed foreign experts. Moreover, the Russians seized key opportunities to advance in the Baltic region. As early as 1702, Peter's forces captured the Swedish fortresses of Noteborg, and Nyenschans, gaining a foothold in Ingria. On the marshy delta of the Neva River, Peter founded a new fortress city in 1703, naming it St. Petersburg, which he called Russia's window to Europe. This new city, destined to be Russia's capital, was constructed on land seized from Sweden and symbolized Peter's determination never to relinquish his access to the Baltic Sea. Despite some setbacks in 1704, 1705, the Swedes, under generals like Adam Ludwig, Löwenhaupt fought spirited holding actions at places like Gemoerdhof and Jakobstadt. By 1706, the strategic tide was slowly turning. Russia's army had grown in size and confidence, even as Sweden's manpower was stretched thin, garrisoning far-flung territories. Peter offered Charles generous peace terms in 1706 to 1707, willing to return much of his conquests except the site of Petersburg, in hopes of avoiding a direct showdown. But Charles V, at the peak of his success, rejected any peace that left Russia in possession of even a slice of Swedish land. The stage was set for an invasion of Russia itself, a campaign that Charles hoped would be his crowning glory, and which would instead become his downfall. The fatal march to Moscow. Charles invades Russia and the disaster at Poltava, 1707-1709. In the autumn of 1707, Charles V marched east with his veteran Swedish army, some 35,000 strong, intent on delivering a death blow to Tsar Peter on his home soil. The plan was ambitious: strike directly at Moscow, the heart of Russia, and force Peter to sue for peace. Charles's army crossed into Russia from Poland, and initially success seemed within reach. In June 1708, Charles won a notable victory at the Battle of Holochen, skillfully outmaneuvering a Russian force twice his size, and proving that Swedish courage and tactical finesse could still carry the day. But after Holochen, the Russian army retreated deeper into the vastness of Mother Russia, and a new kind of war began, one that relied not on pitched battles, but on space, time, and the brutal forces of nature. The Tsar Peter and his generals employed scorched earth tactics. As they withdrew, they burned crops, emptied granaries, and left nothing for the Swedes to forage. Then, as if on cue from the heavens, one of the most ferocious winters in European history struck. The Great Frost of 1708-1709 was said to be the coldest winter in over 500 years. As the temperature plummeted, Charles's soldiers, accustomed to harsh Nordic cold but not the sheer intensity of the Russian steppes freeze, found their supplies dwindling and their horses dying in droves. By early 1709, hunger and exposure had shrunken Charles's once formidable host to barely 20,000 weary men. General Winter, it seemed, was fighting for the Tsar. Worsening the Swedes' plight, a Russian detachment intercepted a vital Swedish supply convoy coming from the west. In September 1708, at the Battle of Lesnaya, General Löwenhaupt's column of reinforcements and provisions was ambushed and largely destroyed by Peter's troops. Tons of gunpowder, food, and ammunition went up in smoke or fell into Russian hands. "We lost our second army and all the bread," one Swedish account lamented, a calamity that left Charles's main army nearly destitute of supplies as winter set in. Desperate for allies and provisions, Charles made a fateful turn south into Ukraine, where he hoped to rendezvous with a potential ally, Ivan Mazepa, hetman of the Ukrainian Cossacks. Mazepa had secretly agreed to rebel against Tsar Peter and support the Swedes, offering shelter and reinforcements. But the Russians learned of Mazepa's defection. In a swift, punitive strike, Peter's ruthless general Alexander Menshikov stormed Mazepa's capital Baturin in November 1708. The city was razed and its population slaughtered, an example made of Mazepa's allies. By the time Charles's starving army limped into Ukraine, they found only ashes where they hoped to find refuge. Mazepa himself escaped and joined Charles with a few thousand Cossack followers, but the Ukrainian hopes for independence died in the embers of Baturin. Come spring 1709, the Swedes, low on food, reduced in numbers, but unbroken in spirit, laid siege to the small Russian-held fortress of Poltava on the Vorskla River in Ukraine. Charles likely aimed to secure much-needed supplies at Poltava and establish a defensible position. Tsar Peter, however, was determined not to let this Swedish force escape. In June 1709, Peter marched an army of about 80,000 men, his main field army, including elite guards and Kalmyk cavalry, to relieve Poltava and confront Charles once and for all. Fate dealt Charles another cruel blow on the eve of battle. On June 17, 1709, while surveying enemy positions, Charles the Valiant was struck in the foot by a stray musket ball, shattering the bone. The wound was so severe that the indomitable king could not stand. As the decisive battle approached, Charles had to relinquish operational command. He appointed Field Marshal Carl Gustav Renskiold to lead the army in the coming fight. Swaddled in bandages and unable to walk, Charles would observe the battle from a litter, unable to personally lead the charge as he had done so often before. Dawn broke on June 28, 1709, July 8 NS, the day of the Battle of Poltava, the moment of reckoning between the Swedish Empire and the resurging Russian Tsardom. In the pre-dawn darkness, Renskiold formed the Swedish army into columns for a surprise attack on the Russian camp. The plan was bold: assault before first light, bypass the Russian field fortifications, redoubts, that Peter's men had built, and smash the Russian army in its encampment. But things immediately went awry. The Swedes lost the element of surprise when Russian sentries spotted a Swedish reconnaissance party and fired alarm shots. Amid the confusion, the Swedish cavalry columns lost their way in the dim light and arrived late to their assembly positions. Precious time slipped by, and dawn was fast approaching. Field Marshal Renskiold hesitated briefly in the face of the disordered plan. Should they cancel the attack now that surprise was lost? Charles, incapacitated but still resolute, urged an attack. Renskiold, steeling himself, reportedly invoked the divine and exclaimed, "In the name of God, then, let us go forward." At roughly 4 Hyasin a.m., with the first light of day, the Swedes launched their assault. They advanced swiftly, charging the Russian redoubts. In furious hand-to-hand fighting, Swedish infantry overran the first line of fieldworks. By 4:30 a.m., 2 Russian redoubts had fallen, with every defending soldier inside cut down. The Swedes, however, paid a price for this early success. Units became disorganized in the maze of smoke, dust, and crossfire. A portion of the Swedish infantry, the column under General Rus, veered off course, attacking a third redoubt, and became isolated. Meanwhile, other Swedish units bypassed some fortifications entirely, pushing onward according to differing interpretations of the unclear orders. The finely oiled Swedish battle plan was starting to fray. By 5 a.m., the Swedish left and right wings had cleared the main line of redoubts and even succeeded in driving off the Russian cavalry, which recoiled at the ferocity of the Swedish charge. For a brief moment, it appeared Charles's men might repeat the magic of Narva and Holosun. The Russians were pushed back toward their camp, but then Renskiold made a fateful decision. Concerned that his forces were too scattered, he halted the advance to regroup and await the missing infantry of General Rus. Those men, however, would never come. Rus's 1,500 stranded troops, bloodied and exhausted after failing to take the third redoubt, had retreated into a forest and surrendered to the Russians by 9:30 a.m. Unaware of this, the main Swedish army stood idle for 2 critical hours on the field, trying to reorganize. This pause gave the Tsar Peter the time he needed to seize the initiative. By 9:01 a.m., Tsar Peter the Great had rallied his forces. With shouts of encouragement and reportedly sharing sips of brandy with common soldiers to stiffen their resolve, Peter led 42 battalions of Russian infantry, some 22,000 men, out of their fortified camp to face the Swedish line. Russian artillery over 80 cannon was brought to bear, lining the ramparts and the field. The Russian regiments deployed in two extended lines with cavalry masses on both flanks. Peter's army now substantially outnumbered the Swedes present on the field, perhaps by 2-1. Still, Charles's troops, the hardened remnant of years of victories, formed up for a last stand behind their banners. The wounded king insisted on being carried to the front in his litter to be with his men even if he could not lead them. The clash that followed was the death knell of the Swedish Empire's army. Russian muskets and cannons opened a furious fire. Swedish formations, lacking sufficient artillery, most of their cannon had been lost with Löwenhaupt's convoy, were shredded by grapeshot and shell. They nonetheless advanced grimly into the firestorm, determined to come to close quarters. In the center, Swedish guards and veterans charged repeatedly, but were mowed down in swathes. Russian dragoons swept around, the flanks isolating pockets of Swedish resistance. Amid the thunder of guns and the smoke of battle, Charles XIII's litter-bearers were shot down. Legend says the king astride his litter urged his beleaguered soldiers to fight on for Sweden. But the situation was hopeless. By 11 a.m., the proud Karelian army had disintegrated on the field of Poltava. Thousands of Swedes lay dead or dying under the Ukrainian sun. Of roughly 20,000 Swedes who took the field that morning, about 6,900 were killed or wounded, and 2,800 captured by day's end. The Russian losses were also heavy, perhaps $8,000, 9,000 killed or wounded, but Tsar Peter had won an unequivocal victory. Charles V, his royal cloak riddled with bullet holes, narrowly escaped capture. Accompanied by a small body of loyal guards and the Cossack hetman Mazeppa, Charles fled south toward the river Dnieper. 3 days later, on July 11, 1709, the remnants of the Swedish army, some 14,000 men, formally surrendered to the Russians at Perevalokna. The Battle of Poltava and the capitulation that followed marked one of history's great turning points. A contemporary wrote, "This shattering defeat in 1709 did not end the war, although it decided it." Indeed, Poltava broke the backbone of the Swedish Empire. Charles's invincible aura was shattered, and the initiative in the Great Northern War passed irretrievably to Russia and her allies. The Battle of Poltava, 1709, contemporary engraving. After initial Swedish success at dawn, Tsar Peter led a massive counterattack, center-right, that encircled and crushed Charles XII's army. Poltava was a decisive turning point that ended Sweden's era of invincibility. Poltava's aftermath was dramatic. King Charles XIV, the Lion of the North, became a fugitive in the south. He sought refuge in the Ottoman Empire, arriving at the town of Bender in present-day Moldova under the protection of the Sultan. The once fearsome Swedish king would spend over 5 years in exile on Ottoman soil, cajoling the Turks to join him in war against Peter, with limited success. Meanwhile, news of Poltava electrified Europe. Former enemies of Sweden who had been neutral or defeated now saw their chance to re-enter the fray. Augustus II of Saxony-Poland reneged on his treaty, retook his Polish crown. Stanislaw fled into exile and allied with Russia once more. Frederick IV of Denmark broke his peace and declared war anew, aiming to regain lost territories now that Sweden was weakened. Even Hanover and Prussia, ruled by opportunistic German princes, one of them George I of Britain, would soon join the coalition to carve off pieces of Sweden's empire. The Great Northern War, far from ending at Poltava, escalated into a total collapse of Sweden's power on all fronts. For Tsar Peter the Great, Poltava was the vindication of his reforms and the dawn of a new era. In a celebratory mood, Peter famously promoted himself from Tsar to Emperor, Imperator, in 1721, and declared that Russia had been reborn as an empire on the victory fields of Poltava. Foreign observers noted that after Poltava, the view of Russia as an aggressive and expansive power had grown stronger. The West realized a new great power had arrived. Russia would henceforth dominate the Baltic region, and Sweden's days as the unrivaled Baltic hegemon were over. The tide turns. From Poltava to the Swedish collapse, 1709–1714, the catastrophic defeat at Poltava sent shockwaves through Sweden. The empire that had expanded for a century now found itself largely defenseless, its king absent and main army gone. Taking swift advantage, Russia and its allies unleashed a series of offensives against Swedish holdings around the Baltic Sea and in northern Europe. What followed was a period of unrelenting crisis for Sweden, battles, sieges, and even plague, a chapter that would see nearly all of Sweden's overseas empire stripped away. First to feel the impact were Sweden's Baltic provinces of Livonia and Estonia, modern Latvia and Estonia. These territories, including the key port cities of Riga and Reval, Tallinn, had still been in Swedish hands when Charles marched on Russia. Now they lay exposed. In late 1709 and 1710, Tsar Peter's forces moved methodically to conquer the Baltic dominions. Russian armies, bolstered by victory, captured Riga in 1710. At the time, Riga was the largest city in the Swedish Empire. Reval, Tallinn, and the rest of Estonia soon capitulated as well. By the end of 1710, all of Swedish Livonia and Estonia had been evicted, as one chronicle put it, from Swedish rule. These conquered lands were formally integrated into the Russian Tsardom, fulfilling Peter's long-held dream of Baltic access. Meanwhile, Poland-Lithuania was reoccupied by Augustus II and his Saxon troops under Russian auspices. The brief reign of Stanislaw Leszczynski ended as he fled to Swedish-held Pomerania. Augustus's restoration brought Poland-Lithuania back to status quo ante in terms of leadership, but the country had been utterly ravaged by years of war and occupation. The population of the Commonwealth plummeted from around 8 million before the war to 6.5 million by 1720, due to war, famine, and disease, a stark indicator of the conflict's toll on civilians. The fabric of the Polish state was frayed, setting the stage for internal weakness in the years to come, even though it technically emerged on the winning side. The Kingdom of Denmark-Norway, having rejoined the war, sought revenge for its earlier defeats. In late 1709, Danish forces invaded southern Sweden, the province of Scania, while Sweden was at its weakest. However, in one of the few bright spots for Sweden during this dark time, an experienced Swedish general, Count Magnus Stenbock, hastily assembled militia and surviving veterans and met the Danes at the Battle of Helsingborg in February 1710. Stenbock won, a resounding victory driving the Danish invaders out of Scania with heavy losses. This Swedish victory saved the Swedish heartland from immediate occupation, a dramatic last stand on home soil. But it was a defensive victory. Stenbock could not carry the war back to Denmark at that point. Having secured southern Sweden for the moment, General Stenbock turned to Germany, where other enemies were closing in. In 1711 and 1712, Russian, Saxon, and Danish forces converged on Swedish Pomerania, Sweden's dominion in northern Germany, including the fortified port of Stralsund. Stenbock daringly marched an army from Sweden's Baltic coast to northern Germany to relieve pressure on these holdings. He achieved a final Swedish battlefield triumph at the Battle of Gadebusch in December 1712, defeating a Saxon-Danish force, the last major victory of Swedish arms in the war. But this success was fleeting. Chased by superior enemy numbers, Stenbock's army became trapped in the neutral duchy of Holstein-Gottorp. By spring 1713, surrounded and with no escape, Stenbock was forced to surrender his remaining 11,000 troops at the Siege of Tönning. Before capitulating, Stenbock vented his fury by setting fire to the Danish-held town of Altona in 1713, reducing it to ashes. The Russians, in retaliation, burned the Swedish coastal town of Wolgast. These fiery reprisals underscored the war's bitterness in its latter stages. By 1713 to 1714, Sweden's situation was dire. Virtually all its possessions outside mainland Sweden and Finland were lost or occupied. In 1714, even Finland, the eastern part of the Swedish realm, fell under Russian invasion. Tsar Peter, determined to force Sweden to its knees, launched a brutal campaign to conquer Finland, known in Finnish memory as the Great Wrath, Isoviha. Russian armies occupied Helsinki and Turku by 1713 to 1714 and won a decisive victory against the remaining Finnish-Swedish forces at the Battle of Storkiro, Napue, in February 1714. The Russian occupation of Finland was accompanied by atrocities. Villages were pillaged, civilians massacred or deported. So harsh was this period that entire regions of Finland were depopulated. Folk tales recall wolves roaming empty homesteads. The Great Wrath lasted until the war's end and left scars on the Finnish populace that endured for generations. On the Baltic Sea, Peter the Great also showcased Russia's growing naval power. He had built a formidable Baltic fleet from scratch since 1703, and by 1714 it was ready to challenge Sweden's navy. In July 1714, at the Battle of Ganget, Hanko Peninsula in Finland, the oar-powered Russian galley fleet outmaneuvered the sailing ships of the Swedish Navy and won Russia's first-ever naval victory. Russian galleys, taking advantage of a dead calm that immobilized the Swedish sail fleet, rowed around the flank and overwhelmed a Swedish detachment. The victory at Gangut allowed the Russians to control the coastal sea lanes, and even to raid the Swedish coast at Umeå in late 1714. Symbolically, it proved that Sweden had lost dominion of the Baltic. The once invincible Royal Swedish Navy was now on the defensive, ceding the initiative to Peter's upstart fleet. Amid these calamities, Charles the Valaniki was still in exile in the Ottoman Empire, restless and chafing to return to the fray. He had managed to incite the Ottomans into a brief war with Russia in 1711, the Pruth River Campaign, where the Turks surrounded Peter's army and forced the Tsar into a humbling negotiation. For a moment, it seemed the Sultan might crush Peter and aid Charles's cause, but the resulting Treaty of Pruth, 1711, allowed Peter to escape with relatively light terms. Russia surrendered the fortress of Azov to the Turks and promised to cease meddling in Polish affairs. Crucially, the Ottomans did not compel Peter to relinquish his Baltic conquests. Thus, the Ottoman intervention, while momentarily threatening to Russia, was in the end without great consequence to Russia's position in the north. Charles's hopes that the Turks might reverse his fortune were dashed. Eventually, after exhausting his welcome, Charles V slipped out of Ottoman territory in 1714. In a daring journey, much of it incognito on horseback across Europe, he raced back to Swedish soil. After over 5 years abroad, the king arrived in Stralsund, Swedish Pomerania, in November 1714, determined to continue the fight. Charles's return was heroic but arguably quixotic. Sweden by 1714 was a nation bled white. Its treasury was empty, its farms short of able-bodied men, its people weary from heavy war taxes, and the recent plague outbreak that ravaged the region from 1708 to 1712. The Great Northern War Plague was the last great bubonic plague in Northern Europe. It killed up to 2/3 of the population in some areas around the Baltic, especially in 1710–1711 when it spread in war-torn lands. Cities like Stockholm and Helsinki lost thousands, and many villages were left completely desolated. War and plague together turned the Baltic coast into a charnel house. Yet Charles V's resolve remained unshaken. One Swedish statesman wrote that the king had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. He still sought victory or honorable death, not a negotiated peace. The final acts. Charles VI's last campaigns and the end of the war, 1715–1721. By 1715, the coalition against Sweden had expanded to include Brandenburg, Prussia, and Hanover, Great Britain's King George I in his German role, all eager to claim pieces of Sweden's empire. Surrounded by enemies, Sweden's chances looked grim. Charles V made his stand in Stralsund, the stout fortress on the German Baltic coast that was Sweden's last toehold in northern Europe. Here, in 1715, Charles personally led the defense against a joint siege by Prussian, Saxon, Danish, and Russian forces. He held out with characteristic bravery, at one point standing atop the ramparts under enemy cannon fire. But by December 1715, Stralsund had become untenable. In a dramatic nighttime escape by boat, Charles slipped out of Stralsund just before it fell. The Swedish king returned to Swedish soil, landing at Skåne for the first time in 15 years. Stralsund's fall marked the end of Sweden's empire in Germany. Soon, Prussia annexed Stettin and the Oder estuary, while Hanover seized Bremen and Verden, German provinces Sweden had once ruled. The lions were feasting on the carcass of Sweden's empire. Yet Charles refused to give up. In 1716, he conceived an audacious plan to knock Denmark-Norway out of the war by a backdoor method: invade Norway, the weaker half of the Danish-Norwegian realm. By occupying Norway, Charles hoped to force Denmark's King Frederick Foss to the table and perhaps trade Norway for peace. In early 1716, Charles led an army across the border into Norway, advancing on the capital, Christiania, Oslo. He laid siege to the Akershus fortress in Oslo and ranged through the southern Norwegian countryside. But supply woes and stiff Norwegian resistance, a guerrilla-style militia war in the forests, foiled Charles's first Norway campaign. By summer 1716, he had to withdraw back to Sweden, his troops hungry and the objective unachieved. Undeterred, Charles tried again 2 years later. In autumn 1718, he launched a twin-pronged invasion of Norway. One Swedish army moved on Trondheim in the north, while Charles himself led another army to besiege Fredriksten Fortress at Halden in the south, a crucial stronghold guarding the route to Norway's heartland. The campaign began with promise, as Swedish forces invested Fredriksten and captured some outworks. Charles XV, now 36 years old, was as bold as ever, inspecting siege trenches under fire and exhorting his engineers to hasten the assault. Then, on the cold night of November 30th, 1718, tragedy struck. While Charles was peering over the parapet of a trench to observe the fortress, a single shot, the source of which remains debated, some say a stray bullet from the fortress, others whisper an assassin in his own camp, struck the king in the head, killing him instantly. The warrior king fell as he had lived, in the front line of battle. Charles's death sent shock and confusion through the Swedish camp. The siege of Fredriksten was abandoned, and the Swedish armies hastily retreated out of Norway in the dead of winter. The death of Charles V was effectively the death of Swedish hopes for victory. Leaderless and exhausted, Sweden finally edged toward peace. Back in Stockholm, Charles's sister Ulrika Eleonora was proclaimed queen. However, she and the Swedish Riksdag parliament understood the stark reality. The nation could no longer sustain this endless war on multiple fronts. Ulrika Eleonora quickly accepted constitutional limits on royal power, ushering in what would be known as Sweden's Age of Liberty, a parliamentary age, and her administration sought terms with the myriad enemies of Sweden. Piece by piece, peace treaties were concluded. Britain's Hanover and Brandenburg Prussia had joined the war chiefly for territorial gain, and they got it. By the treaties of Stockholm in 1719, 1720, Sweden ceded Bremen and Verden to Hanover and southern Swedish Pomerania, including Stettin, to Prussia. Denmark-Norway had been thwarted in its attempts to conquer Sweden's heartland, but in the Treaty of Frederiksborg, 1720, the Danes did secure Sweden's agreement to end the Swedish-Holstein alliance and a sizable war indemnity. Importantly, Sweden relinquished its protection of Holstein-Gottorp, allowing Denmark to dominate that duchy, a strategic gain for Copenhagen, even if direct Danish territorial conquests were few. Denmark also regained full control of the Sound Straits as Sweden waived the exemption that had allowed Swedish ships toll-free passage. The final and most consequential settlement was with Russia. Peace of Nystad was signed on September 10, 1721, ending the war between Sweden and Russia. By this treaty, Sweden ceded to Russia the vast majority of its Baltic territories, Livonia, Estonia, Ingria, and parts of Finnish Karelia. These were the lands Peter had conquered and held, including the city of Riga and the site of St. Petersburg, and now they were legally Russia's. In exchange, Russia returned to Sweden most of Finland, which Russian forces had occupied during the latter years of war, with only minor border adjustments. Russia also paid Sweden 2 million silver thaler, a token indemnity for form's sake. With Nystad, Sweden's era as a great power officially came to an end, and Russia's era as the dominant power in the Baltic began. Shortly after, Peter the Great assumed the title of Emperor of all the Russias, and the Russian Empire was born, its foundation cemented by victory in the Great Northern War. Aftermath and consequences: the end of an empire, the rise of another. When the guns fell silent in 1721, Northern Europe lay transformed. The Great Northern War had lasted 21 years and involved dozens of pitched battles, sieges, and skirmishes across a half-dozen countries. The toll in blood and suffering was staggering. It is estimated that more than 1 million people died as a direct or indirect result of the war. This figure includes soldiers killed in combat, prisoners who died of disease, and countless civilians who perished from famine and plague in war-ravaged lands. Sweden, a nation of only 2.5 million at the war's start, may have lost up to 350,000 people, soldiers, sailors, and civilians, through war and disease, an almost unimaginable 14% of its population. Contemporary records speak of villages in Sweden and Finland where not a single man was left to till the fields after years of conscription and loss. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth saw its population drop by roughly 1.5 million due to the war's depredations. In towns from Poland to Estonia, plague carted away the weak and old. In the countryside, harvests rotted for lack of labor, leading to famine. The war coincided with the Great Northern War Plague, 1708–1712, a calamity that was the last to affect the area around the Baltic and one of the worst in the region's history. In some zones of Estonia and Lithuania, 2/3 to 3/4 of the populace died of plague and its companion, starvation. The four horsemen, war, pestilence, famine, and death, truly rode together during these years, and ordinary people suffered beyond measure. Politically, the war's outcome upended the old order. Sweden, so long the Lion of the North, was spent. The treaties stripped it of its overseas empire. Never again would Swedish armies dominate Europe or march on Moscow. Domestically, the Swedish Empire's collapse also led to profound change. The absolute monarchy that Charles V and Charles XIII had wielded with such military vigor was curtailed. After Charles XV's death, the Swedish nobility and parliament asserted control. In 1720, Queen Ulrika Eleonora, and soon her successor, King Frederick I, accepted a new constitution that ended royal absolutism and transferred power to the Riksdag, parliament. Thus began Sweden's Age of Liberty, a half-century of parliamentary governance unique in Europe at the time. Many Swedes, exhausted by constant war, welcomed this shift. It was a chance to recover and rebuild without the whims of warrior kings dragging them into endless conflicts. Culturally, too, the national psyche shifted. Sweden turned inward, focusing on economic recovery, domestic reforms, and neutrality in foreign affairs, a stance that, remarkably, it would often maintain in the centuries to follow. On the other side, Russia emerged as the great victor and a new great power. Peter the Great's reforms had been vindicated on the battlefield. By war's end, he had secured the Baltic coastline, built a new European-style capital at St. Petersburg, and proven that a modernized Russia could defeat even the most feared Western armies. In 1721, Russia's governing Senate bestowed on Peter the title of Father of the Fatherland, Emperor of all Russia, officially marking the birth of the Russian Empire. With its new ports and expanded territory, Russia could engage more fully in European trade and politics, something Peter had dearly sought. The rest of Europe, initially skeptical of Peter's state, now had to reckon with Russia as a permanent player in the balance of power. The war also had significant effects on other nations. Poland-Lithuania, though it returned to status quo borders, emerged weaker in practice. Augustus II was back on the throne, but the Commonwealth had been ravaged and its nobility divided by the alignments with either Sweden or Saxony. The long-term result was further erosion of central authority in Poland, paving the way for internal anarchy, the infamous liberty of the nobility and liberum veto issues, and, decades later, foreign partitions. Denmark-Norway, while failing to gain much territory, it did not regain the Scanian provinces from Sweden, at least removed the existential threat of Swedish aggression. Denmark solidified control over Schleswig-Holstein, diminishing the influence of the pro-Swedish Holstein-Gottorp dukes, and ensured that the sound dues, tolls on Baltic trade, remained under Danish control. Psychologically, the Danish victory of survival, after the embarrassments of 1700 and 1710, restored Danish prestige and confidence. For the people who lived through it, the Great Northern War was a cataclysm. One 18th-century chronicle described it as 21 years of continuous thunder, under which the peoples of the North groaned and prayed for relief. When peace finally came, a Swedish peasant from Uppland famously remarked, "It is over. The Lord has sent us peace. Never again, in our children's children's time, shall we see such a war." In Sweden, the successive calamities, a famine in 1697, the war from 1700, the plague of 1710, the loss of so many sons, left a deep imprint. Women took on roles in agriculture and local trade in the absence of men. Entire regions like Karlskrona and Göteborg struggled to recover their commerce with so many ships lost. Yet history also records the resilience that followed. The end of the Great Northern War in 1721 marks, in Swedish history, the end of the Stormaktstid, Great Power era, and the beginning of a more modest, peaceful epoch in which Sweden focused on internal improvement. In Russia, conversely, 1721 marked the start of an imperial ascent. The war had effectively swapped the positions of Sweden and Russia in the European hierarchy. As one historian succinctly put it, the result was the end of the Swedish Empire and the rise of Russia. In retrospect, the Great Northern War stands as one of the most dramatic struggles of the early modern period. Its battlefields, Narva, Poltava, Gangut, and others, became legendary, studied by generals in subsequent generations. The war showcased extraordinary characters, the indomitable Charles V, charging fearlessly at Narva and stubborn to the very end, the visionary Peter the Great, transforming his nation and winning an empire through fire and reform, Augustus the Strong, who learned that cunning and shifting loyalties could sometimes regain what brute force lost, and countless unnamed soldiers and civilians whose lives were caught up in the whirlwind. Direct quotes from the era bring these figures to life. We recall Charles's youthful vow never to quit a rightful war except by victory, Peter's determination after Narva, that early defeat would teach ultimate triumph, and Renskiold's prayerful cry, "Let us go forward," on Poltava's fateful morn. These voices echo through time, underscoring the war's epic quality. When the war finally ended, Europe had been remade. The Baltic Sea, once dubbed Sweden's inner lake, was now effectively a Russian-dominated waterway. Sweden itself would never regain the great power status it once had. Instead, it turned inward and, in the centuries since, has often pursued neutrality and development over conquest. Russia, on the other hand, moved onto the center stage of European politics, a role it has played ever since 1721. In a way, the Great Northern War heralded the dawn of a new geopolitical era. The Swedish Empire waned as the Russian Empire was born from its baptism of fire at Poltava. Dramatic, but true to fact, the narrative of the Great Northern War is a tapestry of heroic battles, larger-than-life personalities, and profound human suffering. It is a story of how fortune's wheel can turn. A brilliant young king wins glory after glory, only to see his fortunes reversed by time and fate. An awkward Muscovite Tsar learns from defeat and builds a modern war machine that eventually humbles an old empire. It reminds us that in history, no triumph is permanent and no defeat inevitable, but every decision and sacrifice carries heavy consequences. By the war's end in 1721, the world of 1700 was gone, replaced by a new order. The Great Northern War had dramatically fulfilled its brutal course, educating by sword and fire a generation of nations in the costs of ambition and the changing winds of power.